You're listening to the Clear Creek Resources podcast from Clear Creek Community Church. To hear more, check out clearcreekresources.org.
Hey, thanks for jumping into the podcast today. We're in a series of sermons right now called Marriage Matters, talking about the importance of marriage, how not only we engage with our spouses, but also what that teaches about God and the gospel and the way that Jesus loves us in the church. And so today we're taking a little spin off of that and just talking some really practical stuff. We're talking communication in marriage. And so on the podcast today is my lovely bride, Bethany Lutz, and our friends Tanner and Aaron Smith. Thanks for jumping in.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, so let me ask you this before we get real serious. Where did you guys meet? So we'll tell some of our story, but where did y'all meet? How long did you been married? Maybe what was even like your first impression of each other when you got together?
Yeah, so we've been married for almost 11 years. We met, we were both 18 and met at a show. I was opening for a guy doing a CD release show. And I saw her and thought, that girl's really beautiful. My first impression, I thought she had a child because there was a baby on her hip. Turns out it was your niece. And I was like, because of the former impression I had of her, how beautiful she was, I just thought, all right, I guess I'll raise a kid. We'll do it. Like, it's fine. Not a big deal. That was my impression.
What was your first impression?
Very much the opposite. I was interested in someone else, so it was just a guy.
All right.
Who said hello.
It took some time.
It took some time.
Cool.
I had to woo her.
We'll talk more about that later.
Yeah.
All right. Bethany, how long have we been married? What was your first impression when we met?
Well, we've been married 15 years this summer. My first impression, he'd set up this, like, let's meet for lunch thing, but then brought a friend with him for this lunch
unorthodox.
where we met. Because
It's just
he
safe.
wasn't
It's a safe
sure
move.
if I'd be cool or not, so he needed a safe out. But first impression, I thought I hadn't ever met a lot of, like, nice guys in my life, or even dated any. So that he was just, like, a genuinely nice guy. That was pretty attractive.
There you go.
Nice.
We met through a mutual friend, actually at Clear Creek Community Church. That's a different story for a different day. So, but my first impression meeting her in person was that Bethany was really confident, and I enjoyed like easy conversation with Bethany. So that was our first impression.
That's awesome. And how long have you guys been married?
Almost 15 years. So this summer,
That's amazing.
15 years. All right, so think back to when you're dating. We're talking about communication today. How did you communicate when you were dating, and how has that changed over time? So we'll start with the Smiths, but I want to hear from you too.
You want to take this one?
This is a tough one. I don't communicate well, so I feel like our marriage up until really probably the last year or so has been a struggle bus. I am not great at communicating what I'm thinking or feeling. So I feel like the first few years of our marriage and our relationship was like Tanner constantly trying to pull out anything from me, good or bad. And it was, I don't know.
Our dating relationship consisted of like a lot of one-word text responses, you know? And I was like, I don't think this girl actually likes me. Be like, hey, what's on your mind today? Nothing. Cool.
Period or exclamation
what are you,
mark, because that makes a big difference.
Like no points of
It's like, thumbs up
just
emojis.
thumbs
Just
up. I mean,
like,
just that kind of
good.
stuff. Or I'd want to talk on the phone
I'm not
for
the typical
hours
girl.
at night, and she'd be like, no, I'm tired. I'm going to go to bed. I'd be like, oh, okay, right on. So,
Aaron, is that just personality, or is that family of origin? Like what?
No, I think it's just personality.
Okay.
I'm the quiet one in my family. I mean, we can get loud and rowdy, but my family's very talkative, and I just listen. I sit in the background.
yeah, she's a
take it
good
all in.
listener.
So how has that changed? You said even the last year, maybe things are different than they used to be. How has that changed for you guys?
Yeah, so for me, the last few years we've had, our first few years of marriage there was just so much loss and so much trauma and sickness and illnesses. So it probably wasn't really until we came to Clear Creek almost 4 years ago that I felt some health and some freedom and really was able to like look inward and go like, okay, this is not sustainable for myself or for our marriage or our family. And kind of dig deeper on what needed to change. And for me, that was getting plugged in with counseling and being able to talk to a counselor about all the things that were pent up and things I didn't know how to express, and then kind of pouring that out into our relationship and seeking advice and counsel from other people. And yes, I think it's changed a lot. Still working, still much
That's
to
good.
be improved, but.
So Tanner, with a very different personality and more of an extrovert, more of a communicator, how did you handle that? How did you change from back then to where you are now in communicating in your marriage?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with trust. So early on, there was a lot of fear of like, well, maybe she, was this always what it's going to be like? Or maybe she doesn't really actually like me, or maybe there's this or that. And so for me, it's taking little things and jumping to larger conclusions. And I think the more we've been married, the more I've been able to, I know her character. I know who she is as a person. I can trust her. And we've had great, deep, rich conversations, and we've been through a lot of life together now. So I think it's kind of taken place over time, and then with maturity, and I'm sure we'll talk about this at some point as well, but just instead of making little things into big things, choosing to trust the other person.
Yeah. Good. So Bethany and I have been married for 15, but dated for most of our college experience. So what did communication look like for us back in the dating days versus now? I mean, like married and 3 kids and just plans every night, and like how have our communication rhythms changed?
I mean, when we were dating, we would talk on the phone till like 3 a.m. or we would hang out all the time or write letters to each other when you were working at Pine Cove or Instant Messenger. That was great.
Yeah.
Great way we would.
AIM.
AIM.
Was it AIM then?
AIM, Facebook Messenger too.
Ours was Facebook Messenger. It was just posts like
I was
MSN.
AIM.
No, but I mean together.
Oh,
Yeah, AIM. Those were your
Days were
the
long
other
gone.
boys.
Facebook pokes. I mean, that was like initial.
That was a big thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I mean, we had like endless time. The main thing that would barrier was studying in school.
Yeah.
And whereas like fast forward now, where we have like 3 young children, they're all involved in things, and when we want to talk, they're usually wanting to talk to us too. So it's usually like when kids are in bed, or just having to make a lot more intentional efforts to really like talk with one another, and not just about our schedule and how we're going to tag in and tag out for the day and whose responsibilities are what, but like being able to like connect and like, how is your heart? How are you doing? You seem off today. What's going on?
That's good.
Yeah. And we'll talk about some practical ways we do that. I would say our relationship was very different in that Bethany connects over conversation. So like as we're dating, it's like that's what I realized she connected the most. If we could just have, one-on-one time for her to be able to communicate and me to ask her good questions. And so I would say the thing that's continued in that is the way that we connect is usually over a good meal and just having one-on-one conversation, whether that's one-on-one or with friends.
Yeah.
But like conversation is a way that Bethany really connects. Would you say that's true?
Yeah. I love to talk.
That's
You
good.
do. You do.
As a mom too, I'm sure that's difficult. I know she expresses all the time, just having the presence of small children all the time. There's a difference in communicating with kids and communicating with adults or with your spouse. Like that is a very different form of different rodeo.
Yeah. So I grew up in the church, and I always heard people talk about this book, The 5 Love Languages.
Yeah.
It's a pretty old book now. I don't think I read it until after I got married, but the idea is we all have different love languages, ways we express love, ways we receive love, and one of the ways we communicate love is to know your spouse's love language. That's kind of the overarching theme. So how do y'all talk about that in your marriage? Is like love language conversation ever come up, or is that like we don't talk about that?
It definitely does. I don't think I've ever read the book, but like the
principle's out
the
there,
principle has been around. So we actually do talk about it quite often, because her and I, as we've already probably demonstrated, are just polar opposites in every way. So hopefully some people who are listening or watching this can relate to that. I think it happens a lot. So similarly with love languages, we're just completely different. So is everybody supposed to have 2? Is that how it works?
I don't know.
Because we were just talking about that. Because mine are like words of affirmation, physical touch, and she's like, I'm just one, just
Acts of service.
yeah.
Nothing else
straight
matters
down
to
the
me.
road. Yeah, nothing else.
Nothing else matters.
And so the ways that there's the ways that you receive that, but then also the ways that you give that, and so for us, that's probably been one of the greatest challenges in our marriage, is like figuring out how to communicate love in a way that doesn't just make sense to you,
Right.
but that makes sense to the person that you're
Because that's the
loving.
tendency, right? If it's like, I receive love through
Totally.
words of affirmation, so I'm just going to pour that out on Erin. But that's
Yeah.
not at all how she receives that.
Yeah.
And so learning to express in the way that someone else receives that. I would say ours is pretty similar. We say we're not polar opposites. We complement each other,
Yeah.
right? So every personality profile we ever take, like, we're the exact opposite, but in really cool ways, because where I'm strong, she's weak, or where she's strong, I'm weak. So what would you say our love languages are in comparison to that?
Well, I feel like very similar to the Smiths. I'm definitely like acts of service.
Yeah.
And like quality time.
Yeah, I would say that's the one that we share, though, right? So if I'm a words of affirmation and she's an acts of service person, like quality time together is one that like that's helpful for us.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Any
That's
other
amazing.
love language insight? If there are other personality stuff that you use that's like, man, that's been really helpful in my communication stuff.
I'm fascinated by that stuff.
Yeah.
And another way that we differ is she hates that stuff. So I'll bring up Enneagram stuff all the time. She's just like, don't use that. Or even recently, like I took the 6 types of working geniuses home to her and was just like, this is going to change our life. And she was like, actually, you were pretty gracious about that when you're like, all right, let me hear you out on it or whatever. But yeah, I think specifically just with love languages, it requires a certain amount of selflessness to say, even though this is the way I show love, for me to just dump out like words of affirmation or to dump out physical touch on her when she's been home with our kids and they've been like grabbing at her all day is not only not helpful, it's actually like can be damaging. Like, so I have to really think through the lens of like, no, how can I selflessly come around her and love her? And I'm terrible at that. I would like to be better at that. Yeah.
You're getting better.
Thanks. At least there's
We're
signs
both
of
improving.
improvement.
While we're talking about that, with both of y'all being acts of service people, so I struggle with like, okay, I'm going to do this thing, and I want you to know that it's an act of love, not just being a responsible human, right? Like, how do you receive it knowing that it's an act of service meant as an expression of love versus just like, dude,
Because
do
it was
your
the right
job.
thing to do.
You're not
Yeah.
babysitting; they're your kids.
Yeah.
Right? You're not doing the dishes because you love me; it's because they're your
ate off
dishes.
of them.
Right.
Yeah.
So, how do y'all receive that? Talk about that a little bit. Is that a challenging question?
A little bit.
Does it matter to you either way? Like if it's done with the intent of like, hey, this is how I'm showing you I love you, or just be, in the middle of the night.
I
you
would
didn't
think
even
just
know.
even the most basic things are like the basic foundation of showing me love, and then everything can be built upon. So if you're doing those things faithfully, like taking out the trash or just being proactive with the kids, like when I'm cooking dinner or cleaning up after dinner and helping me out in those ways, shows me love more than just like going above and beyond. Like if you can do the basics, to me, it's like
You feel loved?
I feel loved, and then anything on top of that is just bonus. But
Well, and like doing acts of service without then telling me you've done acts of service, right? So like, if you say, I'm doing this because I want to love and serve you. It's like, I know that, but now but then I'm not great at words of affirmation. I'm not a like super sentimental, I love to talk, but not necessarily like express my feelings a lot,
Yeah.
which is really ironic and doesn't make sense.
No,
But
it
so I
makes
feel like I probably then need to do a better job of thank you for doing this. I recognize that you have done this versus like being told, oh, hey, I did this,
Yeah.
I feel like there's tension both ways. But yes, I think just doing acts of service, seeing that, hey, this really helps her, not just that it means a lot or that's how I feel loved, but that it like alleviates some of the burden of daily life.
Yeah.
I just think there's a tendency to like, I know this is how you receive it, so I'm going to express that, but I got to attach it to the way that I receive it so that it feels legitimate.
Right, yeah.
But man, that's a challenge. It's a challenge.
It is.
So outside of just expressing love to one another, how does knowing your spouse's needs impact the way you communicate with each other? So I know what you need, therefore I'm going to act this way, or I'm going to communicate with you this way. How does that impact it?
We all just take a collective breath. I think that's a really good question. I think for me, sometimes I I've heard, especially for somebody who receives love from acts of service. Did you notice how much I touch her? Like how this is what I'm working on. No, but for somebody who receives acts of service, for me to even just always be asking like, hey, what can I do for you? Is it's almost less helpful as opposed to just seeing the need and meeting the need. So a lot of times when I ask her that question, she's like, I mean, kind of the most helpful thing is for you just to walk around like and just see needs and meet them, you know? So I guess that's kind of, for me, what I think about in terms of knowing what she needs, knowing her, the forms of expressed love that means something to her. Does that make sense?
Sure. Bethany, how does knowing me really well impact the way you communicate with me?
I think that I can anticipate your needs more than other people can because I know you at a deeper level than anybody else does. And so I can like sense when tensions are high or you've had a rough day, even not knowing what's happened in the day and knowing like, okay, like maybe I should do the dishes tonight, or maybe I should make sure the kids aren't quite as nuts as normal, or, you know, like just being able, so I think I'm able to anticipate things and what you need more because I just know you deeper than anybody else.
Yeah.
And I think it's the opposite is true too. It's like, I know when you don't want to communicate, right? So like we joke like
You just need
Bethany's
space.
Yeah, Bethany's not a morning person, right? So like we're not gonna have any serious conversation early in the morning. I am a morning person. I'm up and ready to go, and she's like, I need to drink coffee. I need some alone time before I'm ready to communicate. And so knowing her needs like impacts the way I choose to communicate, when I choose to communicate. When she's cooking or when she's in the middle of doing something that has her focus, like that's not a time to have the really serious conversation. That's a time just to check in on the day, right? Anything else for you, Aaron? Just knowing Tanner better than anybody else knows Tanner, how does it impact the way you communicate with him?
Yeah, that's, oh gosh. I think, I don't know. It's a struggle for me, like I said, to be able to verbalize what I'm feeling and saying, and when he needs physical affection, and I have been touched out by children all day, and just kind of humbling myself, and you just get to a point where you know, no matter what is going on in your day, that there's another person in the narrative. Like your narrative is not the only one, and so just having to put yourself aside, die to self, and go like, okay, this is, even if my day was stressful or I need space, what does this person need? And I feel like your tank is always needing to be filled. So I don't think that there's like a wrong time for me
I'm
to
needy,
to
is
do.
what she's saying.
I'm not saying
really
I'm
nice
needy.
way to say it.
No.
It's true.
I think you really thrive off of those things, and the more I can give it, the better you're able to give me love back. And so just finding that mutual, just pouring out into each other, and like you said, the right times and stuff. But
And I think likewise, like if I know that's that taxing and draining for her, then sometimes I just need to be like, try my best to not be so needy. Like that's one of the ways, me knowing her, knowing that it takes a lot to kind of pull that together in order to say, hey, I know this is what you need, so here it is. For me just to say like, all right, today I don't need to be needy. Today I can recognize you've had a long day at home with the kids. Like you have been taxed, you have been touched, you have been talked to, you have been, pulled at every end. So let me just put myself aside. Take the kids outside, go play on our adventure tree in our front yard, and just give you. We watched a show with the kids called Bluey. Bluey's awesome, and
So good.
there's the episode where it's like, Chili, the mom, she's like, I just need. What did she say?
20 minutes.
I just need 20. Just need a
minutes.
20 or whatever. And the kids are like, why doesn't mommy want to see it? He's like, no. She just needs 20. We're going to go outside and play. And I think that's for me, knowing she just needs space sometimes to recover,
yeah,
to
if I
heal.
can refill, it's so much easier for me to give that love back to you.
Yeah.
I'm just so dry.
It's
most of
crazy.
the
When
time.
you're selfless, you actually reap
how that
something
works.
from that. Go figure.
Bethany, I'll start with you on this one. What's been the biggest challenge with communication in our marriage? So like think back over 15 years. What's been the biggest challenge with the way we communicate or seasons of communication?
I think that the biggest challenge is that we have different communication styles. And so the way that we manage conflict, or, I tend to be more withdrawn. Aaron is really good with words, and I'm not. And so he can thoughtfully think through how he's feeling, whereas I need a lot of time to sit in it and figure out why do I feel frustrated? Why do I feel this way or that way? I have to and it's not because I don't want to talk about it. It's because I don't know how to communicate it the way that makes sense and doesn't make me just sound irrational. So I think that's probably been our biggest tension in communication, is just his need to immediately address things and my need to not, and just be able to and a lot of times I'll have to write things down before I can communicate it. And so I think that's probably been our biggest issue in communication, is just our different styles. But learning each other well to us now know, I feel like we now communicate really well in that, because I know his style, he knows mine, and that we've grown a lot in that.
Yeah. I think for our listeners and viewers, there's a difference between internal and external processors, right?
Yeah.
So Bethany, what she just expressed is an internal processing, whereas it's helpful for me to come home and just process through the day by talking about it, and I get more clarity the more I talk about it. That's just not true for Bethany. So that can be a challenge in marriages. What about you guys? Biggest challenge in communication in your marriage? Outside of Aaron, you already kind of talked about, just your personality lends to some challenges for y'all, but what other than that?
First of all, we totally identify with that. She is an internal processor for sure. I'm an external processor. I need to talk things out to get somewhere, and so that I would say I just agree with that for us. I would say the other thing is for sure handling conflict. If I think back over the years, the 11 years of our marriage, most of the times where I felt like communication was just, we were not understanding one another. It was around some sort of conflict, whether it was from within or from without, but our ability to kind of realize, I think we want the same things, but we're just not expressing that.
Yeah, we're really quick with our tongues, which is so damaging. We're just quick to say what we think or how we feel, and we don't really take the time to kind of pull it back in and make sure that what we're saying is not just damaging the other person and making it worse.
Yeah, or just being quick to listen, slow to speak. Yeah. I think if there was something I could have told first year of marriage, Tanner and Aaron, it's dude, just shut up sometimes. Think about the fact that every word that you say is gonna, in some way, leave a mark on your marriage, and some of those words, you cannot undo that. So, some of the things are that you can roll off the back, but there are real ways in which I can say something and it's going to leave a wound for forever. So, I would say just care with our words, slow to speak, quick to listen.
Let's sit in that conflict thing for a second. So it's been said there's really 3 common responses to conflict, right? There's fight, flight, or freeze.
Yeah.
So talk about your style of responding to conflict. How do you typically respond to that?
Tanner's a fighter.
You go first.
I will kind of freeze up initially, and then I fight. I feel like I'm backed into a corner, and I'm just kind of I don't feel like I have a way out. So the only way to do it is to throw some punches and
verbally throw some punches.
Verbally,
just clarifying.
Yes. That's a great clarification. Yes.
I'm fine. For those watching and listening,
everything's okay.
Blink twice if you need it.
Yeah. How do you think, Tanner?
Yeah. It's funny you say that it's kind of like freeze and then fight, but it's almost because what you need is to flight. What you need is like what you said earlier to just get a minute. So I'm like a fix it, get in there, let's talk about it, especially from what I mentioned earlier. A lot of times with conflict, and I think this happens especially with young marrieds, because we have this innate fear. Kind of the culture I think we grew up in was find the right person to marry. And so because of that, we have this fear for the first couple years of our marriage of, did I marry the wrong person? So then when your spouse exhibits a certain trait or says words or acts a certain way, you're thinking, well, who did I marry? Is this what it's going to be like? Is this really who you are? There's just I think a lot of that. And especially it was for me because I was just very insecure. So for me, it was, well, we need to get to that. Like, let me hear what you said again. Let's talk about it. Is that really how you feel? And I just needed to, analyze and pick it apart. And I began to find out if I could literally just give her 30 minutes, before, and not to say we never need to talk about it, but just give her like literally 30 minutes to just process. She would oftentimes come back and be like, hey, what I said earlier, I didn't really mean, like, I'm sorry, and I'd be like, oh, okay. But if I just ran to it and wanted to fight through it, it became a big argument and would result in damage. Yeah. So
yeah, the most important thing is not getting to like a resolution with the conflict. It's actually how we handle the conflict and the way we treat each other.
Yeah, that's true. That's good. What about you guys?
I would think we relate to everything you just said.
Yeah.
I think that I tend to want to fix it as soon as we can. Let's go ahead and address the conflict, but Bethany needs time to process that. And so if I push her into a corner in the same way you're talking about, it's like she'll say something, but it may not be the most helpful thing for me or her. And I'm like pushing for resolution when it doesn't have to happen as immediately as that. Do you agree?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I tend to just get real quiet. Like Aaron and I are both pretty like mild-mannered people, so like we don't ever have these like blow up, like when we argue, like we've never like blown up at each other. But it's more that I tend to like internalize things, but I'll also internalize things in a way where I think it's not a big deal. Like, why does this bother me? Instead of just being able to initially like communicate my frustration in something, and so then that builds up to where then other things happen, and then another thing, then just like I do combust, and so just having to learn like, hey, if something frustrates me, I need to communicate my frustration or my, conflict then, and try and figure out why I feel that way versus just, and even if it does, because so many times I've said things, I'm like, okay, I know that sounded stupid, but it feels just so good to get that out in the open. And now we know it. We've addressed, okay, that was hormones that week or something legitimate. And just that it's good just to say it and not bottle it up and combust.
I was talking with somebody the other day about just arguments in your marriage and kind of the idea of like as a fighter or as an external processor, I can go win an argument all day long, but I lose, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't ever win a fight in your marriage. Like just the fight itself is a loss. And so how do we come to the place where you guys said like, we're on the same team, we want the same thing without, hurting each other in the way we express conflict? Yeah.
And I think, a part of it is just loving our wives as Christ loved the church too, caring for them, cherishing them in those moments, instead of letting fear take over, instead of letting our need to sort of problem solve and almost engineer them. We have to realize, man, God has created them as unique, beautiful people who have so many more times than us, just wisdom to bring to a situation. Yeah. So there's a level of humility it takes for me to surrender in those moments and say, because 9.7 times out of 10, she's right about whatever it is that we're arguing about. I'm not just saying that as like a stupid cliche. Like, it's really true. I feel like most of the time in the disputes that we have, I come around and realize, wow, you actually are right. So in those moments for me to really learn to listen is difficult, like active listening, where I'm not just waiting for her to finish so that I can say something, but I'm listening to her and truly trying to understand her side of things. That's an art that I'd love to learn one day. It's a really practical way of thinking about listening and communication. So let's dive into that. Let's talk just some really practical things you do in your marriage to be on the same page. So I'll throw out another one as we're talking about conflict. We had this saying, and I think someone told us this, it wasn't original to us, but when our babies were really young, like anything said between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. was immediately forgiven the next day, right? It's like, I know you didn't mean that. Like, so let's just begin the morning by forgiving each other. Like, that's really practical way to think about conflict and communication. That's not carte blanche to say whatever you want in the middle of the night, right? But what are some other practical things y'all do to communicate, to stay on the same page? Bethany, Smiths, all of us. Let's go. Yeah, well, y'all go first. I'd like to hear that.
I think one thing that I always have to like practical thing that I have to remind myself of is to always assume the best of Aaron, right? Like that sometimes we can think, well, he didn't do this, so he's trying to communicate this to me. Or, you know, like we just like make these false narratives in our brain.
Yeah.
That's not fair. And so I think just always like assuming the best of him, knowing that like he loves me so well and loves me so much. But another thing, I remember when Evan was born, our second, I was in just this really funk of a state where I just was overwhelmed and lonely and just felt disconnected. And I knew he was like willing, he wanted to help me, but he also can't just read my mind. And I wanted him to, right? But I remember one night sitting down and writing a list out of like practical ways and like actual tangible things he could do to alleviate the burden I was feeling. And so I made a list. I still have it saved on my phone. It's called How to Help Me Be Me Again. And it was just practical things like I need to see my friends twice a month. I need 3 hours alone, completely alone each week. And like he had this list and be like, I can do that. I can do this. I need you to take the kids to school for me. I need you. And so just communicating that to him, but I had to assess what I needed versus just like, I don't know what I need, figure out what I need. And that was like really helpful in that season and something really practical that I share a lot with other people, like make a list, like know what you need and then communicate it to your spouse, knowing that they want to help you.
I think that's so valuable, especially for young mothers. Like, I mean, that is probably the thing I know we've experienced, and so many of our friends who are just having kids for the first time. That's something that nobody prepares you for as a mother, and nobody prepares a husband for how to care for their wife in those situations. I look back over the course. Now our oldest is 8, so 8 years into parenthood, and I'm like, man, there's so many things I wish I would have done so that she could have maintained her personhood. So that's amazing advice, I think, for those that are listening that have young kids. Like, definitely try to communicate, even if it's the littlest thing that you know. Communicate early and often with those kinds of things. It's really helpful.
Well, even it's just a sign of Bethany knowing me well. It's like Aaron operates well with checklists. He likes to be able to like mark off, like I achieved something, right? Yeah. And so that she served me well by giving me a list. I think just another practical thing with this is like your marriage changes over time. Like the way you communicate will change over time. And so, like we said, when we had babies, we communicated in one way. Now that our kids are a little bit older, like there's some other practical things that we're doing in order to communicate that are different than then. And they'll be different 10 years from now when we're empty nesters. And so a practical thing for our season of life right now is that our kids are starting to stay up a little bit later. There's not nap times. And so those times that were built in for us to be able to connect and communicate are kind of gone. And then we have events every night of the week with baseball and gymnastics. And you just get into that busy season of life with your kids. And so you have to carve out new times for that communication. So we're finally at the place where like our kids can kind of stay home for a little bit by themselves. And so we'll do the dishes and then we're like, hey, we're going to go on a walk. And that's our time to go say the things that we can say without our kids around, right? That we used to be able to do when our kids were going to bed at 7:30 or 8 o'clock. And that's just not reality anymore.
Or when they couldn't read or understand spelling, if we were like, spell things out. Now they'll be like, what are you talking about? I know what you're saying now.
Exactly.
And the things that we can say when our kids are in earshot now are different than they were before. And so, you know, especially with my role on staff at the church, I want to protect them from any conflict that may come or things like that. Like it's changed how we can communicate and what we can communicate about with our kids around. So there's some other really practical stuff too.
That's good.
What about you?
I actually have a book that has been a huge help for us. This is called The Marriage Journal. And it is somebody some friends of ours recommended and actually bought us this book. And so it's literally just a weekly thing that we go through. It has like your
prompts, your weekly prompts.
Yeah, it has a little devotion and all of it's super good. It has like a calendar schedule in it that you basically just say, okay, what's going on this week? Because that can be a huge source of issues of people's communication. It's like, well, I didn't know you had that, and I didn't know we had this, and now we're busy and overwhelmed. We're double booked. And then it has these prompts, simple questions like, what brought you joy this week? What is something that was hard this week? What's one thing I can do for you? Is there any unconfessed sin or conflict or hurt that we need to resolve? What's a dream, craving, or desire that's been on the forefront of your mind? And the unique thing about it is that you take turns scribing, but you both answer the question.
Okay. So you share the journal.
Yeah, which is really helpful because the other day I was scribing, and so I'm asking her, and she's kind of dictating to me, the way that she felt about one of those questions. So I'm writing it down, and she's looking at me writing, and she goes, that's not what I said at all. So even just like, it's helpful for me to literally take what she's saying and then write that down and her to see this is how I'm taking that information and processing it. So just to do that once a week has already changed things for us so much. So I'd recommend this book to anybody. But also some friends of ours who are marriage counselors, actually, really sweet older couple named Keith and Kathy Bates. They're
Davis's.
Keith and Kathy Davis, sorry.
Yes.
My bad.
Really good friends, though.
Really great friends. We're very close.
I have to publicly apologize. Keith and Kathy Davis. Amazing couple, seasoned in their marriage, in counseling and pastoral ministry. They do like weekly or like full week intensives with couples. And they shared a principle with us recently to basically take that, what we were doing once a week, and apply it throughout the week. So just real briefly, kind of the idea around that. In Genesis, right, God creates man, puts him in the garden, and God creating people out of this communal Trinitarian desire for relationship, he puts that in the heart of man. The only thing he says about his creation that's not good is it's not good for him to be alone. So then first marriage happens, this beautiful representation of God's love for the church. But I just wanted to read Genesis 2:24 really quick, because I think it's helpful with this concept. It says, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So we think a lot about that verse in terms of like the becoming one flesh part. That's like the physical intimacy, you're now one, all that. But the holding fast part is extremely important, because the Hebrew word there like implies this, it's like active. It's like a clinging, like a chasing after. So there's the physical side of unity that takes place in marriage, but the way that God designed it is also for this emotional and spiritual communication to happen. And the problem is, like what you're saying, at this stage in our marriages with our kids getting older, that doesn't happen spontaneously. When you're dating,
Carve it out.
Yeah, when you're dating, when you're early in marriage, it's like, well, it's Tuesday. What are we going to do? I don't know, nothing to do. Let's go out and get dinner, and you can just talk. But when you've got kids and you've got a busy schedule, that stuff, just like any discipline, spiritual discipline, like you have to create time, space, distraction-free for that. Just like what you were saying, taking walks. So anyways, they shared with us this concept that they call FaceTime, which they named it that before there was FaceTime on their phone. And it's just like 3 to 4 times a week. It really as often as you can do it, but 30 to 45 minutes of undistracted time where you can sit across something, table, face to face, put your phones away, and just connect on an emotional and spiritual level. And we kind of looked at each other and were like, yeah, we don't have anything like that set up regularly throughout the week. I mean, think about the intentionality that you'd put into your relationship with God. It's like, I want to carve out time to spend to communicate with him. It's the only way I'm going to grow. Or if you want to work out, or if you want to, whatever it is, that stuff can't just happen spontaneously, because if it does, it's not going to work. And so likewise, I'm sorry, this is long-winded, but likewise for us, we've been trying to implement that as a regular routine in our marriage, because for 11 years it hasn't been something. So we've spent this whole time kind of talking about like our flaws and the ways that we are growing from that. This for us was like fresh manna. Like, wow, this is something that we can take and run with. That's really practical for us.
Practical.
Yeah, I think another thing would be the book we just went through in small group, Bless. I know that is more written for our neighbors, our coworkers or things, but applying that in marriage would be so extremely helpful. So begin with prayer, praying together, listening, eating, serving, and even sharing stories. Yeah. Like always reminding each other of who we are and maybe things we don't know about each other from childhood or whatever, and our salvational stories and things like that.
Even stories from the day, stories from what's going on.
Just being really intentional with
That's really helpful.
deep things.
I'm preaching one of the sermons in the series, and talking about finding satisfaction in relationships, how we have this need to be fulfilled in a lot of different ways. And so Mark Carden uses the phrase, the Lee questions, right? How are you doing relationally? How are you doing spiritually? How are you doing emotionally and physically? And so just having a regular rhythm of asking those questions, those Lee questions, like where do you feel unsatisfied in those areas? And what are the ways that I need to help meet some of those needs? And what are the ways that I'm not even designed to be able to meet those needs? Like ultimately, God has to satisfy some needs that I can't fulfill completely. Yeah. And so that's a practical thing. I had a friend that said that they do that really on, like, they call it a State of the Union trip. They take a road trip that's uninterrupted windshield time for 6 or 7 hours. It's like, and everything comes out in the wash in one of those State of the Union kind of trips. But you're intentionally asking those questions. Like, man, how are you doing relationally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically?
I think at first, when we thought of that idea, it was a little overwhelming because when you don't have those conversations all the time, you kind of don't know how to answer that question. Well, I don't even know how I'm doing emotionally. That's where prompts are helpful, even if it's just a few that kind of help you. Like a question like, what brought you joy this week? Is that takes the emotional, how am I doing emotionally? I don't know. That's a lot. It's a loaded question. And just say like, oh yeah, what was hard? What was painful? Like those simple kind of prompts, husbands, like for you to jot down 8 questions, that maybe you could think of, or wives even jot down 8 questions that you could just say, these are ways I can kind of, hold fast or run after, cleave to, to dig in deep and find out who's inside, my spouse. And then if once a week or a few times a week, just to sit down and ask those questions, even if at first it's awkward and you fumble through it and it's messy, it's worth it.
Yeah. It's really good. Really good. Well, I think it's been really helpful, really practical ways that we can kind of bless our church when we talk about marriage, not only in honoring God, but honoring our spouses. And so I think you guys think really well about that, especially you. I'm really grateful for you. You're awesome. Hey, for our church family, I hope this has been a helpful conversation for you as we all seek to honor God with our marriages, but also with our families.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks for having us on. It's been super fun.
Hey, thanks for checking out this video. If you haven't yet, make sure that you hit subscribe down below and check out ClearCreekResources.org, where we have videos, books, and sermons on there, as well as our audio podcast. Thanks for watching.